time if you want.
Okay, Ceann Comhairle, an interesting speech from the Minister. Selective memory, I would suggest, Minister, because I remember the year 2004, and I remember the campaign that was waged in order to get that referendum passed. I remember the comments that were made by Fianna Fáil politicians, by Fine Gael politicians, by Progressive Democrat politicians, and so on and so forth. And you mention about, women arriving at an advanced stage of pregnancy, risks for the health of the mother and the child, women were being exploited, that your concern was for vulnerable women, vulnerable children, people who were being exploited. I remember 2004. I remember the way in which the race card was played, the way the race card was used by establishment politicians from your party and from the other major parties. And the talk about a desire to protect the vulnerable and to protect people from being exploited stands in very sharp contrast with the reality of the direct provision system. And you cannot separate out the 2004 referendum from the direct provision system. The change in the citizenship laws in 2004 was aimed at those seeking asylum, among the most vulnerable people in this country. Asylum seekers were picked out as being to blame for the crisis in the health service in the run-up to the local and European elections. The myth of so-called birth tourism is blown apart when you look at the actual conditions that those seeking asylum are put in here. They were put in those conditions before 2004, during 2004, and they're still living in those conditions today. Direct provision had been in place in the States since the year 2000, just 4 years prior to the change in the law. Those seeking asylum were unable to work. Now they have an extremely restricted right to work. The weekly allowance for those who live in direct provision is €21.60. It's a pittance. The centres are run on a for-profit basis by for-profit operators. They are generally put in isolated locations. There is not an easy ability for people to integrate with the local community. There are major impacts on people's mental health, given an almost prison-like situation that people are forced to live in. Restrictive rules, lack of privacy, inadequate provision for family groups such as living space and kitchens. These are the conditions that these children are born into, and these children were then deprived of citizen rights simply because of their parents seeking asylum here. The reality is that in 20, 30 years' time, when the history books are written, people will look back at the direct provision centres that you preside over as being no better than the Magdalen laundries and the industrial schools of the past. They are the modern-day versions of that. So, direct provision centres and the citizenship referendum go hand in hand. It's a racist policy, and it's got nothing to do with caring for the vulnerable women, the vulnerable children, stopping exploitation, and so on. So let's cut the hypocrisy and have a real discussion about the issues this evening. Now, there's been a global debate around the issue of birthright citizenship, with the ending of it being largely connected with the scapegoating of migrants and minority communities. Across Europe, countries have restricted birthright citizenship and shifted citizenship onto a by-blood model. This can result in situations where minority communities include many that have no citizenship, despite many generations being born in a country. In the United States, birthright citizenship was introduced following the Civil War as part of the ending of slavery and the winning of legal rights by former slaves. In recent years, President Trump has brought this into question and has threatened to issue one of his infamous executive orders to interpret the Constitution so as to exclude children born to undocumented immigrants. There is no shortage of Irish politicians who, rightly, call for the regularisation of the undocumented Irish community in the US. This, of course, is something that any socialist would support. But we also have Irish politicians coming out against Trump when he speaks about reinterpreting the US Constitution's provisions for birthright citizenship due to the impact it would have on the Irish community there. There's hypocrisy here. President Trump would dearly like to implement the law that we have here and that was supported by Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the PDs in 2004. Ireland has removed equal citizenship rights for children, and Ireland has no pathway to regularisation for the undocumented. This is the point that I'd like to deal with in the final third of my speech. Now, it was estimated before Christmas that there are currently between 2,000 and 5,000 undocumented children and young people in this state. Many of them are in a similar position as the Dreamers in the US, who came to that country as children and do not have status. As my colleague outlined, Solidarity will bring forward an amendment to this bill at committee stage that would grant citizenship to those who have had their childhoods here. Not just born here, but who have had their childhoods here. Ireland now has its Dreamers, and this will increasingly be an issue in Irish society, as many of these young people reach adulthood in the next few years and wish to build their lives in their country, but they wish to do it without having any status here. This issue is already bubbling. Last year there was the high-profile case of Eric that was outlined by Deputy Murphy. There was also the case of Nonso, a constituent of the Minister, who was to be deported, and following an excellent campaign by his classmates, teachers and the local community in County Offaly, the Minister reversed the decision to deport his constituent. We are unfortunately likely to see more cases where young people have to campaign for their classmates who may face serious issues like deportations, and also for the right of access to third-level education and employment rights as they leave school. The government does not give any real pathway to regularisation for young people. At the moment, the only mechanism is to apply for humanitarian leave to remain. The serious issue with how this is linked to deportation orders being issued, if the Minister does not grant humanitarian leave, deportation order onto the agenda. The Minister must outline a pathway to regularisation for these young people. You know, Minister, that the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2016 outlined clearly and graphically the lack of a regularisation scheme in this state and described it as a failure by the Irish state. It is a failure. You have to report by 2020 as to what you intend to do about it. You should do the right thing. The Migrant Rights Centre have done excellent work in this area and have worked closely with undocumented young people. They have reported on the real impact of growing up undocumented. I mean, imagine it. The mental stress on young people, the fear, the stigma. Despite being in second-level education, they are unable to progress to third-level education. There are concerns with any interactions with the state. The simple process of applying for a PPS number could trigger a process of deportation. And my final remarks, I'll just go back to what I said at the start. The referendum in 2004, the birth of this, these changes, it wasn't an atmosphere of humanitarian concern, protecting the vulnerable, stopping exploitation, etc. I was there. I remember it. I remember the conversations that were in the pubs, the conversations that were on the streets, the debate that was in society that was being fostered and fanned from above by politicians who wanted votes in the European and local elections, and it was a racist agenda. It was nothing to do with the concerns of ordinary people. That type of policy needs to be put in the past, it needs to be challenged, it needs to be reversed, not defended in any sense.
Thank you, Deputy.